At 755, the Stuarts of England, Scotland, and Ireland navigated the complexities of state, church, and society, as seen through the lens of the Wynne family of Gwydir Castle in North Wales, whose fate was intricately tied to the Stuarts. At 1636, the tumultuous reigns of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II were marked by struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state. At 1642, the English Civil War erupted, with the Wynne family's fortunes rising and falling in tandem with those of the Stuarts, amidst the backdrop of a Europe torn apart by religious conflict, the plague, and the Great Fire of London. By 1688, a Catholic king, James II, fled his country and his throne, bringing an end to the Stuart dynasty's reign. At the outset, James I inherited a throne through his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, which would bring the two kingdoms together, but at a bloody cost. I admire James I, and I like his intellect and his inquiring mind. He was somebody who was very curious about life, a man who was trying to make sense of the world. It is very important to James that he felt himself committed to promoting unity of his peoples, the peoples of England, Ireland, and Scotland, unity of Europe, and the union of Christianity itself, which might even unite Protestants and Catholics. 1729 saw the rise of Charles I, the reluctant king, pushed into being the heir because his brother, the magnificently suitable Prince Henry, had died. Charles struggled to be the king that everyone longed for, though history remembers Charles I as having lost his head, having lost the Civil War. We forget the years when he was seen as the luckiest monarchy in Europe. He was a highly sophisticated king who really put British visual culture on the map, both in terms of what was happening in the world of art and architecture. By 1700, Charles II had commissioned the work of Rubens and Van Dyck, and his collection would bring unity and glamour back to the country. The people were won over by the austerity of Cromwell and the parliamentary era, and ecstatically welcomed the new king. During the reign of Charles II, the birth of modern times emerged, with clever people literally rebuilding England, and the fire in London enabled the city to be rebuilt. At about 1700, it must have been exciting to look around and find oneself in this spanking new city. James II, the Catholic king of a Protestant country, was a disaster waiting to happen. History is very tough on James II. He was a very brave, headstrong figure, a very good soldier, and a very good admiral. But unfortunately, being so pig-headedly Roman Catholic was his undoing. In the autumn of 1605, a letter arrived at Gwydir Castle for the owner, Sir John Wynne. It contained an urgent message that implicated him. That November, John Wynne had not travelled to London for the opening of Parliament, a decision that would prove fortunate as King James I, all his ministers, and the Lords would be attending. Unbeknownst to John Wynne at the time, he had just received a tip-off about the most notorious attempted attack in British history, the Gunpowder Plot. A small group of religious fanatics wanted to blow up Parliament, kill the king, and return Protestant England to the Catholic faith. The plot failed. But to this day, the 5th of November is celebrated across the county with bonfires and fireworks. At this time, there was far more to King James I's rule than gunpowder, treason, and plot. James was the first of a new dynasty to rule England, the Stuarts, and he came to the throne at a dangerous time. Britain was divided as never before, between nations, between religions, between rulers, and the world was in rebellion. Queen Elizabeth I had died on the 24th of March, 1603, after ruling England for over 44 years. At 1703, King James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had put to death, was to succeed to the English throne, despite the difficult family history. However, James' first succession to the English throne had been agreed by both parties via secret correspondence in the years before Elizabeth's death. At the age of 13 months, James had held the Scottish throne, but now he would sit on the thrones of England and Ireland as well, in what was known as the Union of the Crowns. At this time, the Charter House in Smithfield, London, a magnificent complex that began life as a home to Carthusian monks in the 14th century, stood as a testament to the era. Its days as a monastery were brought to a violent end during the reign of Henry VIII, and it became one of the great aristocratic houses during the Tudor period. When King James VI of Scotland, soon to be King James I of England, headed down from Edinburgh to London, he held his first evening court, marking the beginning of a new era in British history. The Stuart, at 800 hours, James had been invited to do so by Thomas Howard, who would be rewarded with the title of Lord Chamberlain in the new king's government. Charlton House is now a palace of the Howard family, Suffolk resident, related to the man who had tried to depose Elizabeth in favour of James' mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. So, the Howards are people he knows, are loyal to him, and it seems to him that he's going to make him Lord Chamberlain, the head of his household, the man in charge of the everyday management of the court, a crucial figure, and he should be given priority when it comes to meetings in London. At 900 hours, James had been greeted by huge crowds of enthusiastic supporters as he made his way down from Scotland, but things turned sour almost as soon as he reached London and held his first court here at the Charlton House. The original monastery built on this site was constructed on land that had been used to bury the countless dead from the Great Plague. At the commencement of the 14th century, the threat of another outbreak always remained, and it so happened that the dreaded disease returned with a vengeance almost as soon as James arrived. It hampered his plans for coronation, and for many of his citizens, it was a bad omen about his reign. Plague had been something they had all lived with in these houses forever. They were well used to outbreaks of the plague, not just in London, but local outbreaks as well. Those who did not like James thought it was a judgment from God. Those who did like James thought it was an unfortunate coincidence of play. There was apprehension because he was a foreigner, and the English, on the whole, did not like the Scots, and they were worried about a Scottish takeover. James had to balance that very carefully, as he did not want to become a purely English king, neglecting his original kingdom to the north. But neither did he want the Scots to take over. Initially, he did a particularly very good balancing act. At 1800 hours, King James knew he had to be especially cautious of usurpers, as his father, Lord Darnley, had been murdered, and his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been executed. He had faced attempts on his life whilst ruling in Scotland, and this did not change in England. Almost immediately, two plots were being made to remove him from power: the main plot and the by-plot, with one of Queen Elizabeth's favourites even involved in the conspiracy. However, it was the gunpowder plot of 1605 that would come the closest to eliminating King James I. The Wynnes, here at Gwydir, were supporters of the new King James and were advancing in courtly life. John Wynne, head of the family, was about to return to Whitehall. "Attending Parliament would be injurious to my health," he said. "What meaning do you impute to that? Come on, boy, he is your physician. The city," he said, "will be fetid, of course, and all manner of thieves and cutthroats will dog my journey, with plenty more to be found in Parliament besides." But, even before, was it thus, and not let? At midnight, the stresses of Parliament, even the King's own right, posed a problem, as plots, such as the gunpowder plot, required sufficient people to carry out the aftermath of the assassination of the King. But the more people involved, the more likely it was that the wrong people would be informed, and they would leak it, which seemed to have happened. At this point, it is one of the great what-if moments in history. The 13 conspirators hired a cellar directly below the chamber in which James was due to appear, under the supervision of their munitions expert, Guy Fawkes, and they filled the cellar with dozens of barrels of gunpowder, more than enough to do the job. However, at around 9 o'clock, too many people were being warned to stay away, which aroused suspicions, including a warning from a Catholic priest to his old friend, John Wynne, and an anonymous letter which eventually made its way to the king. At 1605, the gunpowder plot was foiled at the last moment, saving Parliament from destruction. King James I continued to rule over Scotland, Ireland, and England, but this would be a challenging reign, to say the least. Having been raised a Protestant, a Catholic conspiracy had been made against his life, which further worsened matters. Not all of his new subjects were loyal, and the Stuart king faced numerous challenges. 17 earlier, at the behest of his Privy Council, Thomas Howard, the owner of the Castle House, and the new Lord Chamberlain, headed down to the cellars of Parliament to investigate. The entire cellars were searched, and Guy Fawkes and his barrels of gunpowder were discovered after days of terrible torture. Fawkes confessed, and the other conspirators were either killed or captured. The plot had failed, triggering national rejoicing. However, the plot exposed the divisions in James' new kingdom, raising questions about how he would handle these challenges and how the Wynne family would thrive in this dangerous new world. The demise of the would-be terrorists triggered national rejoicing, but the failed plot had far-reaching consequences. The Stuart monarchs, including Charles I, Charles II, and James II, would face numerous challenges in the years to come, including the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, which would ultimately shape the course of British history. At 1500 hours, James I sought to maintain peace amid divisions, tightening anti-Catholic measures after the gunpowder plot, but otherwise broadly tolerating religious difference, provided it did not threaten his rule. A lack of money was a constant issue, and James hoped his new kingdom would solve his financial woes. However, his extravagant court meant new money-making ventures were needed, benefiting the Wynne family of North Wales. Following the issuance of letters patent, Owen's father was made a baronet, with His Majesty bestowing upon them a great honour, albeit one they had to pay for, £300 per year for 3 years to purchase the title. In the 17th century, the Wynne family, perhaps one of the very first to receive the baronet, a new hereditary knighthood, at the James Institutes, saw John Wynne as one of the first baronets, due to being perceived as the senior Knight of Wales, with 2 representatives of Wales, one from the south, Stadling, and one from the north, John Wynne. Prior to this, it was self-evident when they compiled the list. The title would be the family's forever. It would be our duty, both John's and his sons after that, to invest in books, a sign of royal favour, and a sign that the king had run out of money, as the family and young brothers were better off investing in books. At this time, John was very much a man of his period, being canny, acquisitive, intelligent, and well-educated, carving out an empire for himself in North Wales, where his extraordinary dominance in all public affairs meant he was destined to be on the list of prominent figures. However, his rise to power was not without its challenges, as many of his contemporaries, particularly his neighbours, grew jealous and envious of his success, which was built on the backs of those he surpassed. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Wynnes and the Stuarts was mutually beneficial, with John gaining great power and status, and King James acquiring much-needed funds for the treasury by selling titles to his most loyal subjects at an excellent price. King James required funds directly from wealthy families in the county, as he frequently found himself at odds with Parliament in both Scotland and England, driven by his desire to unify the 2 kingdoms, which, after all, shared the same island and were now under the same rule. At 700 hours, Amidst a world where monarchies wielded absolute power, the Stuarts of England, Scotland, and Ireland navigated the complexities of state, church, and society, as exemplified by the Wind family of Gwydir Castle in North Wales, whose fate was intricately tied to the Stuarts. This family's story explores the tumultuous reigns of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, marked by struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state. At this time, it was believed that God had made it so for a reason. The English and Scottish parliaments were fiercely opposed to the idea of Great Britain. However, for debates, they were about prejudice. Scots feared they would be ignored by the English, while the English feared the Scots would undercut wages and steal jobs. Mutual animosity ensued. The scheme never proceeded. On the margins, there were people who really could not take James. They could not take a Scotsman. They could not take a Protestant. So, there were a group of plotters who engaged themselves with the idea of getting rid of him and replacing him with his cousin, Arabella Stuart, who was also descended from Henry VIII's elder sister. There was also the problem of competing visions. James believed in the divine right of kings. He illustrated his views in two of his published works, The True Law of Free Monarchy and Basilikon Doron, which is Greek for royal gift. James believed he was chosen by God to rule. Therefore, the law was an extension of his power, and Parliament was subordinate. At 12:05, many in Parliament viewed the relationship differently. They believed a king ruled through partnership and cooperation with lawmakers. This fundamental disagreement doomed the relationship, and for much of his reign, James attempted to rule without Parliament, hence the need for extra sources of money. At 1800, one of the tragedies of the Stuarts, looking back on the executions, the exiles, and the generally disastrous relationship with Parliament, though a lot of the century or so that they were in control in this country. And one thing that is absolutely true is that they never had enough money, and Parliament wasn't prepared to give enough, or to tax enough in their own way. James brings in such charges on customs, which are called impositions, which don't have parliamentary authority, and therefore are controversial with some, and the result of that is the kings can manage on their own income in peacetime. The problem is, what will they do if they get into wars? Then you do need parliamentary supply. At a time of great turmoil, James I was struck by the greatest tragedy that could befall a man who believed in the divine right of kings, the death of his firstborn son and heir. James had two children who survived infancy. Henry, who had all the hallmarks of being a great all-around great sportsman, great promoter of the arts, but also someone who was clearly quite radical in his Protestantism and strongly supportive of the Protestant cause internationally. Henry dies in a most unwise exercise of athleticism by swimming in the Thames and getting typhoid from the water. Meanwhile, his younger brother Charles, who had had rickets as a child, was bandy-legged, small, had a stutter, and wasn't intellectually the match of his older brother. He lives on and is to be the heir. It is always suspected that when James and perhaps Anne looked at Charles, they always looked with regret, wondering why he was the survivor, why their golden boy had died. The country was devastated. At 2300 hours, on the 23rd of August, 1614, devastating news arose from Lucca in Italy concerning the passing of the Wind's eldest son, John. His companions dispatched the news from Tuscany, demonstrating at least some decency. At Gwydir Castle, Sir John Wynne would suffer a similar tragic loss, not long after the death of the heir to the throne, Prince Henry. Following his demise, requests were made to the parish. Firstly, of course, to the family, with his father, Owen, bequeathing £10 for the purchase of books, advising temperance to maintain usual habits, which should suffice for a week. Perhaps Sir John Jr. would inherit his father's velvet coat, which he was instructed to put on. It is noteworthy that James I loses his eldest son, Prince Henry, and Sir John Wynne loses his eldest son, Sir John Jr. Thus, they both found themselves in similar circumstances. At this time, the Wynne family found themselves in a position where the second sons had to take over. And it was interesting that Sir John Wynne took over that county role and ended up serving Charles, who was himself the second in line. The Wynne family and the Stuarts grew very close, as Sir John Wynne was appointed groom of the bedchamber to Charles, the new heir to the throne, and would join him on a wild and highly secretive voyage to Spain. At present, both families were in deep mourning. Sir John Wynne must make ready, being required to stay a day or two for his mother's sake. He served the young prince, who was a fine marksman, tolerably so, and a better rider than most, although he stammered and spoke too softly. His efforts, however, were certain to gladden his father. At this point, King James seemed beset on all sides, and he increasingly relied only upon his closest advisers. But this also led to huge resentments over the years, with the chief among them being his infamous and controversial favourites. At this time, speculation has long existed regarding James I's sexuality, as despite being married to Anne of Denmark, with whom he had 7 children, he was invariably drawn to handsome men, often with disastrous consequences. The favourite of his childhood years in Scotland, the Duke of Lennox, had been forced out by jealous lords, whilst another close companion, Obert, met a similarly unfortunate end. James then transferred his affections to another young courtier, a man named George Villiers, who would utilize the king's favour to sideline rival factions, enrich his family, and become the most powerful nobleman in the country. Meanwhile, the Wynne family was not the only one ascending the social ladder during James's reign. Villiers was obviously fantastically physically attractive, as noted by ambassadors at the time, who were utterly struck down by his physical beauty, of which he was very aware. At 1630, construction began on the Queen's House in Greenwich, a magnificent building designed by the greatest architect of his era, Inigo Jones. By this time, the Stuart dynasty had established its reign, with James I at the helm, who had fallen deeply in love with George Villiers, a man born into a decent but not massively wealthy gentry family. James elevated Villiers to every stage, from baron to viscount, earl, marquess, and ultimately duke, a title that had not been bestowed upon a non-royal in centuries. This sparked jealousy amongst the over-mighty courtiers, but Villiers' rise through the aristocracy was facilitated by the favour from the royal crown, which cascaded through his wide family. It must have been incredibly difficult for the old aristocracy to witness this man rise from almost nothing to become, by a significant distance, the most powerful man in the kingdom. George Villiers would be raised to the title of Duke of Buckingham, remaining at the king's side for the rest of his reign, and playing a crucial part in the events that would push England into war. At 16, the construction of the Queen's House commenced under the orders of King James I, and was intended as a gift for his wife, Anne of Denmark, whom he had married in 1589, but Anne would never see it finished. By 1619, Anne had fallen ill soon after construction began and died. Anne remains a mysterious figure, emblematic of the challenging religious era in which she reigned. She had been raised as a Lutheran in Denmark, but it is possible that she may have secretly converted to Catholicism at some point in her life. She infamously refused an Anglican communion at her coronation in England. If Anne did convert, even the Queen had to keep it a very tightly guarded secret. The lore of the old faith seems to have been present for the Wynne family at Gwyde Castle as well, but being a Catholic was a very dangerous endeavour. Around this time, the prince still pinned his hopes on the Spanish match, and he had a portrait of the Infanta, whom he much admired. At this time, it is clear that Lady Sidney, wife of the king, came from an old faith family, the Heads of Lancashire, and reading between the lines, it is pretty clear that she remained Catholic, albeit secretly, as a crypto-Catholic, and was allowed Mass for herself and her household. By 1900, the Infanta's contact should be made, and she will not be queen, as a papal stallion in England could suffer, but not a Spaniard, until the tide shifts, and then marvel at how forgetful of his past a man can be. At this time, the tragedy of Catholic versus Protestant was contained within the royal house, a question that was never resolved, concerning whether England should become a Catholic or a Protestant country. This led to the terrible and bloody English Civil War. Becoming a known Catholic or a recusant would lead to enormous fines, so large that one's estate would be bled dry, ultimately resulting in its demise. At 1619, King James I had lost his wife and his firstborn son, and he would not get any respite in foreign affairs, as war had broken out on the continent. The 30 Years' War started in 1618. What began as a quarrel among the divided states of the Holy Roman Empire drew in all the major powers of the day, and with 8 million casualties, it became the bloodiest religious conflict. At the start of James I's reign, many of his subjects in England and Scotland would be furious at any return to the Catholic religion in the royal family. But still, despite this, James attempted a union with Catholic Spain. By the time of the Glorious Revolution, the delicate religious situation in the country had been a major issue for many years, and many people had been practicing what might be flippantly called cafeteria Catholicism, particularly with people like St. John and the Stuart kings, who were well aware of the delicate religious situation in the country. 1740. It was also the greatest foreign policy failure of King James I, and for the British living across the sea from the 30 Years' War, it must have been a very frightening spectacle, especially with the propaganda coming back from both sides, which resonated very much over here, that this sort of absolute catastrophe could happen here. Though religious bigotry, I think, it was something that the English looked at askance and thought, we just cannot have that here. 1620. James was a peacemaker. He had ended the long Anglo-Spanish War soon after inheriting the throne, and he had grand hopes of securing a lasting peace in Europe. To do this, he began the negotiations to marry his heir, Charles, to the Catholic Infanta of Spain, Maria Anna. The protected talks were unpopular with the English Protestants. James, however, was more tolerant of religious differences than many, and he persevered. He believed finding England and Catholic Spain together would help secure peace. At 1820, the 30 Years' War confounded all those hopes. It was a conflict the king could not ignore because he had a personal stake in it. His daughter Elizabeth, she was married to the Protestant Frederick V of the Electoral Palatinate, a pivotal figure in the early years of the war. At that time, England was requiring that the Spanish drive their cousins, the Austrians, out of the lands of James's daughter and her husband in the Palatinate, and that used to ask him too much. One is asking too much, and that one is expecting the children of the marriage to be brought up as Catholics, and James and Charles cannot deliver that. So, both sides were willing to make a deal, but only on their own terms, and the gap between them was simply too great. After the catastrophic defeat of Elizabeth and Frederick's forces at the Battle of White Mountain outside Prague in November 1620, James had to intervene, but war was expensive, and money had long been a problem for the English crown. James would call Parliament, but the meeting was problematic. At 1223, the situation was fraught, and the members of Parliament were more interested in investigating abuses by James's government than in granting him the financial support he desired. James soon dissolved the meeting, as he had done on numerous occasions previously. He now had no alternative but to rely on his diplomatic endeavors. The Spanish match for his son was the only opportunity he perceived of defusing the conflict, and assisting his daughter. Negotiations with Madrid commenced once more, but at the same slow pace as before. Frustrated by these constant delays, James' favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, and his son, Prince Charles, made an extraordinary decision. "It is my ill fortune to be one of those who is shortly to follow the prince into Spain. Passed out, the journey will be dangerous and expensive, but as subject and servant, I must needs obey." Prince Charles and the Duke of Buckingham were heading to Spain incognito, as Sir John Harrington, Southerton, and Ichard were going with them. In February 1623, this group left England in disguise for a potentially powerless journey across Europe. The goal was to secure a marriage between Prince Charles and the Spanish Infanta, a prospect that seemed increasingly unlikely. At 1823, in the spring, Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, and the Duke of Buckingham were travelling to Spain, along with Ichard, the heir to the Winchester state. 1823 was the year when Charles was attempting to win the hand of the Spanish Infante in a romantic yet doomed endeavour. At this time, Prince Charles was navigating the complexities of marriage negotiations. In a letter written by Ichard to his family, he expressed his discontent with Spain. The letter offers fascinating insights into the era, including an encounter with a Spanish Jesuit priest. The priest's description of England in Ichard's letter vividly illustrates the religious challenges of the era. Prior to Henry VIII's reign, the King of England, the subjects were obedient children to their mother, the Church of Rome, with many famous martyrs who suffered for the cause, such as Thomas Becket and Sir Thomas More, and diverse others. Henry VIII was the first king to satisfy his own lust and bring his adulterous conception to the forefront. At this time, the dissolution of the abbeys and the execution of hundreds of people had altered the course of obedience to the Church of Rome. Theological opinions, including the denial of the Saviour's own words, stating that the Eucharist is but a sign and not the body and blood itself, were among the most egregious. 1700 hours saw Prince Charles' ill-fated Spanish venture, an extraordinarily amateurish and silly diplomatic disaster. Prince Charles, accompanied by Duke Buckingham and Sir Richard Wynne, embarked on this ill-conceived mission, despite Sir Richard's low opinion of Spain. At 1700, the disguised royal procession finally arrived in Madrid, where their host presented them with impossible demands. The Duke of Buckingham got into terrible quarrels with a Spanish equivalent. 18 months prior, the Duke had travelled to Spain to negotiate a marriage between Charles, the future king, and the Spanish Infanta. However, the Spanish infantry did not really take to Charles, who was not a Catholic, but an infidel who turned his back on the Church of Rome. This was not going to be as straightforward as his father James' marriage to the Lutheran Princess of Denmark. James I was married to the Lutheran Princess of Denmark, and when the royal party arrived in Madrid, they were met with a series of obstacles. The Spanish made impossible demands, which the Duke of Buckingham struggled to negotiate. The trip was eventful, with many adventures, but ultimately they failed to secure a sensible deal on the Infanta's hand. Despite this, it is very interesting that Sir Richard is a witness to this event, and not only a witness, but also produces this account of the royal trip to Spain, which is very amusing. At 21, Prince Charles had to negotiate for himself, hardly fitting for a future king. The whole business of adopting disguises as travelling gentlemen and calling yourself Mr. Smith, which is entirely silly, very adolescent, involving going boating, dressing up, and getting drunk. At that time, it was clear how that would go down with the strict protocol of the Court of Madrid. Utterly ridiculous to think that anything other than disaster would come out of that. It soon became clear that the Spanish had been stringing Charles along all the time, just enough to keep England out of the 30 Years' War. Charles was virtually cast out after bursting in on the young Infanta in her own private garden. The men returned home humiliated. At that time, the heat between those hills was such that we thought ourselves in stoves. yet at their heights we walked on snow and cold. It was then that England, in the midst of a conflict, was shot and bleeding, and they fed you not over 3 at issue, was not the quantity. 1716, with father's blessing, the publication was set to occur. At this time, the conversation turned to the prince's great adventure in Spain. The English court, however, was deemed insignificant compared to the severity of the Spanish. The prince had convinced himself he was in love, but all chance of speaking with the Infante was denied him. The public, nonetheless, was delighted by their failure, eager to catch this and embittered by their time in Spain. Charles and Buckingham switched sides, pushing the reluctant James towards war with Spain. By 1720, Parliament was summoned once again. This time its anti-Spanish sentiment was equalled by many at court. Despite this combined pressure, James still entertained doubts. At 27 March 1625, James I, who had been ailing for a fortnight with tertian fever, died, and the young King Charles I was proclaimed. The Wynne family had lost their firstborn son and heir at the same time as the Stuarts and the royal family, who were about to lose their patriarch as well. Sir John Wynne was also succumbing to the ravages of old age. In a letter it was written, "At noon on 27 March 1625, the king died after being sick for a fortnight with tertian fever. The new king has promised to deal nobly, and a great office is expected." The letter expressed hope for the recipients' recovery from their recent sickness and assured them that every endeavour was made to be worthy of their example, signed by their dear and loyal son, Richard. In 1625, James I died, having been ailing for quite a long time. At 1745, Charles II's reign was marred by struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. 18 years prior, his father, Charles I, faced similar challenges, which ultimately led to his demise. At 2300 hours, James I's death sparked rumours of foul play, with many believing Buckingham had poisoned him due to his unpopularity among the political elite. Historians have recently begun to re-evaluate the story that Buckingham had murdered James and that Charles had condoned it. These claims haunted Charles right down to his own death 24 years later and were very prevalent in the months before the outbreak of civil war. Historians debate James' legacy, with some viewing him as an intelligent, flawed man who brought peace in a time of extremism, whilst others see him as stubborn, extravagant, and responsible for sowing the seeds of his son's own clashes with Parliament and the bitter English Civil War that was to come. The Stuarts' reign, spanning many years, was marked by struggles with Parliament, ultimately shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state. At 1800 hours, Charles I followed in his father's footsteps with his profound belief in the divine right of kings and a misplaced trust in the Duke of Buckingham. Charles' shunning of Parliament and autocratic style of rule fueled enormous political and religious tensions in his kingdoms. A civil war would break out across the British Isles, and in the end, the House of Stuart would fall, and the Commonwealth, headed by a commoner called Oliver Cromwell, would rise in its place. At this time, the fall of the monarchy would be a nightmare for the Wynne family of North Wales, who would have to fight to survive in this new Puritan era. England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland would never be the same again. Charles I succeeded James I, who had inherited the throne from his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, which had brought the two kingdoms together, but at such a bloody cost. Charles struggled to be the king that everyone longed for in the very beginning of his reign. At 1200 hours, Charles I plunges England into 2 simultaneous wars to fight both of the superpowers simultaneously, a crazy endeavour. And the result, of course, is that all the campaigns are failures. He did believe in the divine right of kings. He believed he was placed there by God. Though history we think Charles I lost his head, having lost a civil war, but we forget the years when he was seen as the luckiest monarch in Europe. He was highly sophisticated. He really put British visual culture on the map, both in terms of what he commissioned, the form of Rubens and Van Dyck, but also what he collected. At 1600 hours, Charles II, the Restoration would bring unity and glamour back to the country. The people were won out by the austerity of Cromwell and the parliamentary era, and ecstatically welcomed the new king, James II. The Catholic king of a Protestant country was disaster waiting to happen. At 1625, Charles I became King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, succeeding his father, King James I. The Stuarts, monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland, navigated the complexities of state, church, and society, as seen through the lens of the Wynd family of Gwydy Castle in North Wales, whose fate was intricately tied to the Stuarts. During the reign of King James I, the head of the family had been knighted and was later elevated to the position of baronet. However, it was during the reign of King Charles I that the connection between the two families grew closest. Charles I, like his father, believed in the divine right of kings and shunned Parliament as irrelevant, resulting in a tempestuous reign that eventually led to the outbreak of a civil war. At that time, Sir John was a confidant to the new King Charles I and was appointed Groom of the Bedchamber and Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Sir John and King Charles were long acquainted, having even joined his future king on a rather disastrous trip to Spain in 1623. Charles had hoped to negotiate his marriage to the Spanish Infanta Maria Ana. At 1823, Charles' journey to Spain, undertaken to secure the hand of the King Philip III's daughter, ended in humiliation, forcing him to return home. Charles' absolute failure in Spain was a source of delight for many back in England who did not desire their future king to marry a Catholic. This was supposed to be a Protestant country. However, despite protests, Charles still ended up marrying a Catholic. During his fateful journey to Spain, he had visited Paris, where he met Henrietta Maria, daughter of King Henry IV of France. The journey, although unsuccessful in its primary goal, was not entirely in vain, as Charles and Henrietta Maria were married in Canterbury in 1625. Henrietta Maria got married on the understanding with Pope Urban that she would try and do her best to bring England back to the true faith of Roman Catholicism, and also on the sort of understanding that she would do her best to influence the royal family itself, the children that she would produce. The real problem was she was very zealously Catholic. At 1823, Ichadwin is said to have acquired 12 saplings from Spain. 2 years later, in the year of the coronation of marriage, 1625, he supposedly planted them out, which are the famous cedars at Buda. These are the ones that survive. These are the earliest statement of royalism, which is going to be a feat. At the time, flaunting Catholicism was prevalent, even to the extent that she refused to take part in the coronation because she would not have the proceedings overseen by a Protestant. It was something that was anathema to her. It's very puzzling, if you're a modern person, to find the answer to why it should have been such a source of contention that Charles, the first ever monarch to be brought up as a member of the Church of England, shouldn't have been married to a woman who was Catholic. She was French. You have really strong religious prejudices on the side of Queen Henrietta and of a lot of people in political power in England, and it was something that would have needed somebody to back down, and it wasn't going to be the politicians. At 1700, the relationship between the Wynds and the House of Stuart was a complex one. This is the Queen's House in Greenwich, designed by the great architect Inigo Jones, intended as a gift from King James I to his wife, Anna of Denmark. However, she died during its construction, and the building was put on hold. Construction recommences on the Queen's House when King Charles decided it would make a wonderful gift for his new wife, Henrietta Maria. A second level was even added by Inigo Jones, and Henrietta became one of Inigo's key benefactors. Just like her husband, Henrietta Maria was a devoted patron of the arts. Fortunately for the Queen, she had Richard Wynne as a treasurer to help fund her artistic endeavours, so Richard would sign off the payments and often paid with funds from his own estate. Thus, Richard Wynne was now a firmly established figure in the royal house of Stuart, treasurer to the Queen, consort groom of the bedchamber to the King. At this time, a particular honour was bestowed upon a select individual, granting them the right to touch the King. By 1900, this honour was still revered, and the King's favourite artists, such as the exceedingly popular Anthony van Dyck, were often called upon to prepare the new king for his many portraits. Van Dyck's skill was unparalleled, and his impact on portrait painting was profound, creating a sense of illusion and realism that captivated the nation, much like Daniel Maitens had done before him, but with far greater finesse. At the onset of Charles I's reign, Van Dyck was instrumental in shaping the king's image, sweeping the board with his masterful strokes, and for the first time, people genuinely began to move in pictures, as if brought to life by the artist's genius. The effect was mesmerizing, and Van Dyck's legacy would forever change the landscape of British art, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's history. At 1700, the possibilities of an artist like Van Dyck. He collected the works of Titian. He was familiar, and through osmosis of contact with the works of the High Renaissance, he knew that there were ways of portraying him and his court in a way that was different from the past. At this time, physically speaking, he was not prepossessing. He had a slightly gnomish face, very pronounced, slightly goggle eyes. He was also very small. He was 5'4". He had bow legs, and he had rickets when he was young, and so he needed an artist to transform this unprepossessing human form into something magnificent. And I genuinely feel that when you look at those portraits of Charles, the first Van Dyck has elevated him with a subtle manipulation of the brush into an almost regal presence. At 1830, a Stuart-like figure, Van Dyck, brought with him this box of tricks from the High Renaissance, and he dumped them down in London, with all the tools, all the insights, all the technical brilliance and proficiency, all the sort of poetic mood that he was able to imbue his sitters with. He transformed the way we looked. At this time, Charles faced the same difficulties as his father, King James I, a strange relationship with Parliament and an urgent need to raise funds, though unpopular taxes would force his reign into extreme tensions. With a 30 Years' War raging on the continent, it would not be long before the country plunged into its own civil war and blood would flow. In North Wales, Sir John Wynne, the owner of Gwydir Castle, inherited his property and his titles from his father, Sir John Wynne. Sir John's brother, Owen, was a bookish type, interested in a variety of subjects, including the mysterious business of alchemy. Owen preferred to stay here at the family seat. At the beginning of Charles I's reign, he married Henrietta Maria, daughter of the King of France, just a couple of months after gaining the throne. He was already planning a war with Spain, following failed attempts to marry the Spanish Infanta. Charles inherited the same problems as his father, including a poor relationship with Parliament and a misplaced trust in a particular figure at court, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke had been a favourite of King James and had retained a considerable amount of influence over King Charles. This was due to a sort of intense friendship, which started on both sides from a mutual regard for how powerful the other one was. Buckingham desired to maintain his royal favour, which he certainly did not want to lose due to the change of rule, whilst Charles desired to be loved by his father, and what better way to achieve this than to show favour to his favourite? At the outset, there was a sort of element of intelligence on both parts that, diplomatically, they should make the most of each other, as it was going to further their own interest. After Jame's death, Buckingham maintained this extraordinary hold over the throne for the remaining 3 years of Buckingham's life. From the very beginning, Charles and Parliament did not get on. Distrust builds very quickly, not least because Charles was pouring money into failed military campaigns led by Buckingham, and Parliament did not see why it should continue to give money. He starts raising money under his prerogative in ways that are truly controversial. It is one of the major issues which generates the distrust of Charles, which is going to be the background of factors for a civil war a few years later. Despite a lack of finances, Charles pressed ahead with his intervention in the 30 Years' War. An expedition was launched against Spain. Buckingham oversaw an alliance with the Dutch, and the plan was effectively to engage in privateering. At 1828, the Duke of Buckingham was stabbed to death in Portsmouth by a disgruntled army officer. 23 August, Buckingham's life came to an end, marking a significant event in the tumultuous reign of King Charles I. The king and the court mourned Buckingham deeply, but the rest of the country pretty much celebrated his death. The rift between the king and the country was growing deeper. One of the officers, Felton, who had been on his first mission, stabbed him to death, and Buckingham knew the wound was fatal. He actually called it out. The shock in this country of the greatest non-royal in the country being just commonly as expected. Earlier, in an attempt to aid Spanish treasure ships returning from the New World with gold, and then to attack Spanish towns, the 30 Years' War proved to be a complete disaster, marked by bad luck and incompetence. At least 1,000 English soldiers died with nothing to show for it. People blamed the already unpopular Duke of Buckingham, and the Second Parliament noted impeaching him, but Charles dismissed them to spare his friend. However, he could not protect the Duke of Buckingham from all the threats. At 8 o'clock, the assassination was absolutely astonishing, as a lot of people did not like the influence Buckingham had, but the thought of him suddenly being gone at the blade of an assassin was something that took a lot of coming to terms with. Once Buckingham was dead, Ishad Nguyen was one of King Charles' most trusted advisors, but he could also be viewed as one of the king's greatest benefactors. At 9 o'clock, Ishad's father, C. John Wynne, had been offered a baronetcy by King James and bought it at a hefty price. Only Parliament could levy taxes, so Stuart monarchs had to find new, inventive ways of acquiring funds if they were going to ignore Parliament, asking Charles to do so. He generated new income through the highly unpopular ship money levy, which was essentially a tax intended for wartime but was now levied during peacetime. It had only been imposed on counties that lay on the coast, but it was now applied inland as well. Families like the Wynnes would be the ones footing this massive. At this time, it is worth noting that Master Inigo Jones himself supervised the construction, a bridge by the surveyor to His Majesty, and one is surprised the king can spare him. He must be a man much occupied. A generosity typical of his character, 25 shillings and fourpence, that is the king's demand. Apologies, generosity that arrived this morning, courtesy of the sheriff, ship money owed on our estate. Are we to dispute over 25 shillings? That is but the latest demand. Both we bear the Queen's debts, we pay the king's ship money. Were it not for the Irish estates, the king must have means to build his palace, while our roofs fall in. Whitehall is dilapidated. It shames the nation. The nation has other concerns. I have seen the pamphlets. The printing press may echo a voice 1,000 times over. It is still but one man. Do not be swayed by malice in London. The nation is happy. At a certain point, one of the tragedies of the Stuarts is that they never had enough money, and Parliament wasn't prepared to give enough or to tax enough in their own. At this time, Charles I was very keen to get around this problem and to use whatever device he could come up with. Anything connected to the crown, to raise money, he would look at, and ship money was the first really big disaster in terms of confrontation with people who were not prepared to put up with what they saw as an abuse of kingly power. There is a case for it. There was a big European war going on. 20,000 English young people, mainly men, being captured by pirates coming from North Africa and taking them off to be slaves in North Africa. Charles I, in fairness, was building up the navy in a very dramatic way, which was good for the nation, but to impose a tax on internal counties of England for the growing of the navy was a really difficult concept for people who were being asked to pay it. He will not recall Parliament, then why let that disputatious gathering disturb the peace? I have conducted alchemical investigations. These many years, vapours foul and copious are a near constant. At 1700 hours, it became apparent that the containment of grievances without safe release would bring great misfortune. Parliament is the vessel, the country is the vessel, and the long containment of grievances without safe release will bring us all to great misfortune. The king may rule without Parliament, so long as he wishes, but it is not his prerogative. I doubt both, but his wisdom. It is a very fine bridge to do it without consulting Parliament and then say, well, I have a right in a national emergency to raise these sorts of monies, when in fact there's time to call a Parliament, is to abuse your power. It was just the first major step of Charles being seen as an absolutist monarch in an unacceptable, very un-British way. The 30 Years' War had begun as a religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, and although King Charles disengaged from the conflict, the religious tensions persisted. At 1639, divisions within his own kingdoms did not disappear, as England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland all had their own unique and combustible mix of Catholics and Protestants. Many also suspected Charles of secret Catholic sympathies, given that his wife was French, and his attempts to help Protestant allies in Europe were seen as half-hearted. Together with his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, Charles passed a series of anti-Calvinist reforms which were particularly unpopular in Scotland. The church and public rebelled against Charles, who could not stand this affront to his authority, but he did not have the funds to raise an adequate army. Scottish forces swept into England, seizing Northumberland and forcing the king to pay them for the privilege. Charles had no choice but to recall Parliament, humiliated by the Scots and backed into a corner by his finances. At this time, Charles could not dismiss the members, and the men of Parliament quickly moved against Charlist government, with advisers being impeached and new acts being introduced. At this time, it seemed that the king was prevented from ruling alone, as had been the case in previous times, with some days being good and others bad. However, the remedy was often found at home. Executing Chief Minister Stafford had not purchased a moment's respite, and had His Majesty not called Parliament last year, it is believed the Earl of Warwick would have marched on London. Now, bit by bit, they are eroding his prerogative with an act for preventing the long intermission of parliaments, an act declaring ship money unlawful and void, and an act for the regulation of the Privy Council. His Majesty is most sensible of the disrespect he will brook, though he says it is but a few malcontents goading and leading the abolition. If it turns to conflict, it would not be wise to be in London. My place is with His Majesty. Tensions were reaching boiling point in Ireland, with terrible killings taking place between Catholics and Protestants, and rumours abounded. Parliament wanted to impeach. At 1842, Charles marched on the House of Commons with an armed guard to arrest who he thought were his enemies, the opposition leaders, but the Speaker refused to surrender the MPs. Not long afterwards, Charles left London, which was increasingly hostile to him. Further negotiations with Parliament failed, and soon both sides were raising armies. At Nottingham, on the 22nd of August, 1642, Charles raised the royal standard, and the English Civil War had begun. For there to be an English Civil War, there has to be a collapse of authority in Ireland and Scotland first. You have to send an army to Ireland in order to safeguard the Protestants, who have not been massacred. You can't trust the king with that army, but the king can't possibly be expected to, as king, give over the power to control armies to a parliament that is a legislative body, not an executive body, So that becomes the non-negotiable issue. Charles' Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria, was accused of collusion with the rebels, which for the king was the last straw. At 1830, all tensions in England erupted into violence, and I foresee the Civil War approaching due to a shift in the tectonic plates of politics, society, and religion. These were very bloody affairs occurring on the continent, showcasing the intensity of religious sentiment on both sides. A similar feeling existed here regarding what is religiously right, with people passionately believing in their particular brand of Christianity to the point of death. By 1740, I think one of the things about Charles I was his almost besetting sin, which was tactlessness. They were so in love with their idea of what the church was and how it would be beautified that they were stupidly intolerant of the Puritans. Definitely, there was a class of people in the political sphere of England who believed they should represent the interests of the country versus the court. Equally vehemently, you have Charles I and, before him, James I, believing absolutely and rigidly in the divine right of kings. By 1608. At this time, a sort of religious conflict and a philosophical one arose about who was actually in charge of this country and what it was about. Came the question of everything being ready. Your Majesty, do you know what they say of me in these pamphlets? I do not read them myself. They say I plot with some that I conspire for the propagation of popery in my kingdoms. They are seditious, so they are banned, lewd, and wicked, but fire must with fire be matched. I have all the printing presses be conveyed to Oxford with the court. Very wise, our own newsletter, where they entice with empty falsehood, we shall nourish with the truth. So equipped, will the people shake off their current sickness and better affection be to their king. I shall return, Richard. And just such a welcome. The stage was set for civil war. Charles on one side, Parliament on the other. Charles' belief in the divine right of kings was about to be severely tested. Charles set up his capital in Oxford. His strengths lay in the north and west, whereas Parliament's lay in the south and east. At 1842, the initial battles of the Civil War were pretty much a draw, alongside intermittent and futile peace talks. At this time, Father asks, "What news of the war?" The response is, "It's from one of our tenants, a clothier, who cannot pass any lines to each marketing show, Shrewsbury. Our doves cannot take their cattle into England either. Perhaps they should fight instead, if their lord would not forbid it." Wisely, they keep themselves apart, and no matter if people think they are cowards, if people talk of themselves, we are right to hear such a word. I would correct it very seriously. At this point, I think the Royalists were in the ascendant, from the summer of 1642 until Marston Moor in 1644, marginally. I think the energy of the Royalists was quite impressive, but the fundamentals were against the Royalists. The longer the war went on, the more the Navy being for Parliament and London being for Parliament, and then, when the Scots came in, that was really the end. At 1740, the wealth was in London and the southeast, and control of the Navy. At 1645, a turning point occurred. As he did believe in the divine right of kings, he believed he was placed there by God. It was his destiny as an anointed king to be the supreme head of the British state. Whilst the Puritans disputed this Hebrew idea that there is only one king, namely Almighty God, they disputed the idea that Charles Stuart, that man of blood as they called him, should make any such claim. 18 years prior, a man had said, "I am a man grown. We've spoken about this. It's not my duty to serve the king. These people lived in the mountains. They sowed no crop. Their livelihood was in cloth and cattle. Only by reaching market could they pay the rent. Only with their rent could they support the king. That is our duty." Meanwhile, it was said, "It is you cannot stop me." But most of these doves, these clothiers, were too old for the fight. They were perhaps fearful of losing what they held dear. That does not mean that they have forgotten what it is to be young and eager. One sentiment was, "I want to fight." The year 1645 was a turning point in the Civil War that so far had been a stalemate. Many in Parliament were unhappy. At 1845, the advantage and resources of the parliamentarian forces had not translated into victory, prompting suspicions of half-hearted leadership amongst some commanders, and thus demands for change ensued. Consequently, in January 1645, the new model army was founded, intended to be a professional, well-trained national army, unrestricted to a specific geographical area, unlike the old militia, with promotions based on merit rather than social status. At late spring 1645, the new model army, under the command of Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell, first took to the field, with their inaugural major battle occurring on 14th June at Naseby, where they confronted the king's smaller yet more experienced force, resulting in a stunning victory for the new parliamentary forces. Naseby, in Northamptonshire, marked the decisive turning point, as the destruction of the king's main marching army and his wonderful infantry rendered his recovery virtually impossible, given the limited territory under his control, which was insufficient to sustain the war effort. The emergence of the new model army heralded a significant shift. With their first major campaign, at 28, a fine victory might have been his in France. Instead, he was gallanted with humiliation. Now defeat hovers quickly upon defeat. By this time, his last port is besieged and his forces spent, and word comes that he would seek refuge here. At 2100, it is believed that he came here to Gwydir Castle upon the invitation of Sir Ichad Nguyen, who was at the side of King Charles as his brother. Owen received this message at Gwydir. He was an unfortunate king. Had the winds been otherwise, a fine victory might have been his. At the time, at the height of the conflict, Charles retreated to his capital, Oxford. Later, Charles headed for Conway Valley in North Wales, where he had loyal support. At the midpoint of Northamptonshire, a clear sign that Parliament has an instrument that will ensure that they will not lose the benefits of their great victory. That noise, we defeat, robbed Charles of his best men, his artillery, his stores, and his grip over the royalist heartland of the West Country. Charles retreated to his capital, Oxford. Late Charles headed for Conway Valley in North Wales, where he had loyal support. At this time, offering a hand to a drowning man may pull you down with him, and painting ourselves too loud a royal hue may make us the victor's prize. However, we will guide at the last eject. For Caesar, should peace be stuck, his kingdom retained, he may remember the friends that betrayed him with more anger than the enemies that fought him. Once an alchemic reaction is begun, it cannot so easily be undone. The king, a charming man with good qualities, a thoughtful and good family man, but a terrible king, had taken very poor advice at many key junctures. The problem with Charles was his weakness, and it used to drive Henrietta Maria mad, as she would write to him from the safety of the continent, saying, "You agreed to do this, but you did that, yet again. What are you doing?" And he could not help himself. He was easily swayed, which was not suitable for a decade like the 1640s, where a weak king would not be tolerated. At 1846, good outcome for the county or for him, King Charles was running out of options. He was forced to surrender to the Scottish army on the 5th of May, and after months of negotiation, Charles was given up into the custody of the English Parliament, essentially taken to prison. Charles did not give up hope. He knew about growing divisions between the Scots and the English, and between Parliament and the new model army. So he had a plan. At that time, he made a secret agreement with the Scots. They would invade England, and with the help of the remaining worthy forces, restore Charles to the throne. In return, Charles would establish a Scottish Presbyterian religion in England. The king, having lost the war, tries to win the peace. He tries to play off his enemies against one another. Then, it is not impossible that it could have worked if he had been a little bit more flexible. In 1647, he could probably have made a deal with the army, and the army would have put him back on the throne in return. At 1848, the Second Civil War erupted, but it was brief. The new model army put down the royalist rebellions before defeating the Scottish forces at Preston in August. Charles was forced to negotiate, but those divisions between the new model army and Parliament had not gone away. At this time, Parliament voted narrowly to continue negotiating with the king. But by now the army and Oliver Cromwell thought Charles a tyrant who had to be removed. Choosing between the radical demands of the army and a king who surely is chastened and wiser than he was when they first fought him, faced by that, the army has a choice, and the army decides that God will not forgive them. Earlier, it had seemed that complete religious freedom was what was desired, but instead, there should be complete liberty. And that was better for him, having an Episcopalian system, a weak Church of England with complete freedom outside, rather than a strict Scottish-style church government, an opportunity he did not take. At 1700 hours, the army occupies London, purges Parliament, removes a majority of MPs, and puts the king on trial. When the king is finally taken, it is interesting that Sir Richard Wynne, of course, as well as his royal duties, was an MP, and he then has to watch the slow unravelling of the royalist cause he had been in service of for all these years. Already, when he was prince, and going all the way through, having carried his robes at the coronation, having been with him on a drunken jaunt in Spain, having done all those things with the king, and then, ultimately, with the queen. It must have been terrifyingly difficult for anyone to cope with this. There was a strong element of Parliament who were not in favour of the king being tried on any level. It was a huge jump for people mentally to go from the king that they had always been taught as being a representative of God and a figure of great authority. At 1849, although he had been defeated in battle repeatedly, and despite reneging on agreements, he was still the king, and to numerous loyalist members of Parliament, they could understand a way forward, where the king might be persuaded to be a more acceptable form of himself. 1649 was the year that saw the trial of a king, something new in England, as no existing court thought the trial legal, so Parliament had to create a special body to try Charles, and it met for the first time in Westminster Hall on the 20th of January. Charles was accused of high treason, held responsible for all the death and destruction caused by the war. Of course, Charles didn't recognize the court's authority. He refused to enter a plea, insisting the trial was not only illegal by English law, but against God as well. The colonels of the new model army were the dominant force, really, in the trial of Charles. The first, they'd seen too much bloodshed, and they could then only see Charles as this famous phrase, this man of blood. He was no longer. At 8:45, Charles, King of England, stood on a pedestal, yet he was just another man who had caused this appalling bloodshed. It is always worth remembering that the English civil wars caused the heaviest loss of life, percentage of population in this country ever, including the First World War, and the casualties were even worse than in Scotland and considerably worse in Ireland. By this stage, people who hated the king, or certainly loathed the bloodshed that went with the king's cause, thought that if they could just behead the monarch, literally, then they could have a fresh start and no more blood. The court sentenced Charles to death. He bade farewell to his children, who were with him to the end. He requested 2 shirts, so that he would not shiver from the cold and give the impression of being afraid. At 10:30, the king was beheaded on a scaffold outside Banqueting House in Whitehall on the 30th of January, 1649. At 8:45, the execution of Charles I took place. 1745 was not the time, but rather the year of our tale is not relevant here. The soldiers kept us at a fair remove. A scaffold had been erected. It was at the Banqueting House, designed by Master Jones. I could not hear what he said. I saw him speak a prayer and kneel at the block, hands outstretched before him. When the axe fell, the crowd gave out a moan, as I never heard before, and I may never do so again. Charles, King and Martyr, Charles. It is interesting that seated wind just sort of fizzles out. In a few months after the execution of the king, he is dead himself. In the 19th century, they would have romantically said he died of a broken heart. But he really had no purpose. He sort of fizzled out. It is a sort of unspecified illness, I think, just wasted away, probably due to grief. The House of Lords was abolished, and an executive power wielded by Parliament and its Council of State. The new model army was the most powerful force in Britain, shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state. Under the tumultuous reigns of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II. At 1853, Cromwell, in command, swept aside all remaining military opposition. Cromwell disbanded Parliament as he thought it quiescent and ineffective, and seized power as Lord Protector. In the end, the bloody English civil war between King and Parliament saw both sides lose. All the while, across the sea, Charles' son and heir waited in exile. At a later time, in the next episode of the Stuarts, a bloody reign, the heir to the throne, Charles II, goes into hiding on the continent, where he is stunned by the news that his father has been put to death. For over a decade, Charles travels in exile around the royal houses of Europe, planning to overthrow Cromwell's Commonwealth and restore the House of Stuart. However, his attempts are in vain, and it seems all hopes are lost. Nevertheless, the tides began to turn back in the Stuarts' favour with the death of Cromwell. Soon, Charles II will be welcomed with open arms by an adoring public in London. In the reign of Charles II, who finally came to the throne after years in exile following the execution of his father, Charles I, the people were won over by the austerity of Cromwell in the parliamentary era. They ecstatically welcomed the new king, who spent 11 years desperately wanting to be king, and once he became king, he did not want to do anything. At this time, one had the birth of modern times. With clever people, Charles II was so relaxed, just interested in a luxurious life. But there was one part of him that was unforgiving, and that was his attitude towards those who had been involved in the death of his father. At 1700, England was literally being rebuilt, and the fire in London had enabled the city to be rebuilt, making it an exciting time to be alive. By this time, one would have found themselves in a spanking new city. In this series, we are examining the reigns of the Stuart kings through the lives of the Wynne family at Gwydir Castle in North Wales. The Wynnes had flourished during the reign of King James I and his son, King Charles I. John Wynne, the patriarch of the family, had been knighted and honoured with a baronetcy. His son, Sir Richard Wynne, was a friend of King Charles I and had been appointed First Gentleman of the Bedchamber, as well as treasurer to the new Queen, Henrietta Maria. However, by the time of 30 January 1649, the situation had reached an all-time low for both the Stuarts and the Wynnes, as King Charles I was executed. The Royalists had lost the Civil War, and the reign of the Stuarts appeared to be over, with the entire system of monarchy under threat. At this time, the complexities of state, church, and society, as navigated by the Stuarts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, were being reshaped by the tumultuous reigns of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, marked by struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, which would ultimately shape the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state. At 1840, a new system of government emerged, the Commonwealth, wherein England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were ruled over by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. He, the hero of the new model army, had a spectacular career, rising from being the poorest man to make it to Parliament in 1640. Cromwell was a dynamic individual, totally committed to godly reformation, convinced that God had called him to some great cause. He rose from being a captain in 1642 to lieutenant general, heading the cavalry of the new model army, and eventually becoming the head of the entire army. He led unparalleled, successful, and brutal campaigns in Ireland and Scotland. At the time of the execution of Charles I, his wife, Henrietta Maria, had to escape and found refuge in the French court. His son, Charles, attempted to muster forces in France and the Netherlands, but they became royal prey, pursued out of the country. At 846, the County Henrietta Maria fled in a ship from the southwest to France under gunfire from Parliament. The future James II, as a young boy, managed to escape from Sion House in Middlesex, dressed as a girl, and was spirited away to the Netherlands. Meanwhile, there was a little Princess Elizabeth who sadly sort of faded away and died in Carisbrooke Castle in the Isle of Wight between 1646 and 51. The future Charles II endured a really humiliating exile. The story is that nobody dared tell Charles II that his father had been executed, and they didn't know what to do. So, one of the senior coaches went in to see Charles II. Instead of saying, "Your Royal Highness," which would have been his title as prince, Bowden said, "Your Majesty," meaning you are now the king. Charles took a moment to understand it, but when he did, it was an absolute body blow. The Wind family at Gwydir Castle were deeply affected by the execution of Charles I. So Ithiel, or possibly another family member, had lost both his king and his seat at Parliament. At 1848, he had been expelled by the Pride's Purge, orchestrated by Oliver Cromwell, and Sir Ichard was heartbroken, and he would never recover, and he died just a few months after King Charles was beheaded. Succeeding Sir Ichard as the new head of the Wind family would be his younger brother, Sir Owen. Sir Owen was a very different character, bookish, and endlessly intrigued by the possibilities of alchemy. It was not easy for Sir Owen, as he was the third son, and he was the more bookish one. He was not the sort of glamorous courtier his brother Sir Ichard had been, and so he was given all sorts of difficult jobs. He had to look after the estate for his brother. His brother gave him an allowance to do so, and he was at the brunt of it. He was during the Civil War, and of course Lady Grace's wife, so it cannot have been easy during the Civil War. Having all of this going on, being twice sacked, being seriously squeezed in terms of finances. At this time, Sir Owen had to be especially careful under this new Commonwealth. At 1653, Oliver Cromwell had firmly established his grip on power, having been sworn in as Lord Protector, and drastically altered the cultural landscape of the country. The theatre was outlawed. Celebration of Christmas and Easter was banned for quite a lot of the 1650s. At that time, Oliver Cromwell was ruling England as Lord Protector, refusing to take the title of king, but very much like a king. His policy of promoting religious liberty benefited a lot of people, including, of course, some Anglicans and even Catholics, who had a much easier time under Cromwell than they had under any of the Stuarts. Prior to this, the Wind family had been close to the deposed royal house of Stuart, and there was a very real threat that the Wynn estate could be seized by force at any moment, just like worthless families up and down the country. Following the end of the English Civil War and the battles that occurred across Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, known as the War of the Three Kingdoms, by the time of his 60th birthday, Cromwell's legacy was firmly in place, shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state, as the Stuarts, including James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, navigated the complexities of state, church, and society, marking their tumultuous reigns with struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. At 2158, the possibility that the Stuart option might have faded away emerged as Oliver Cromwell fell ill and died, and was succeeded by his son Richard Cromwell. However, Richard lacked any real authority, as the position of Lord Protector could not be inherited, which begged the question of how this differed from the monarchy. A power vacuum was developing, and the Booth Rebellion was one of several attempts to fill it. Sir George Booth, a former Member of Parliament, organised an uprising against Richard Cromwell in 1659, joined in his efforts by another former Member of Parliament, Sir Thomas Middleton, and Middleton's son-in-law. Richard Wynne, the young son of Sir Owen, found that the Booth Rebellion had been planned in the regions near Gwydir Castle, North Wales, and the northwest of England. The forces assembled were able to take the important city of Chester, but although Cromwell's power was undoubtedly failing and the Commonwealth was weak, Booth's rebellion was still put down. Booth himself managed to escape. At 1659, a pivotal moment in British history unfolds. Sir Echad Wynne, a member of the influential Wynne family of Gwydelwern Castle in North Wales, finds himself entangled in the tumultuous events of the time, marked by the struggles of the Stuart monarchs. The Stuarts of England, Scotland, and Ireland navigated the complexities of state, church, and society, with notable figures including James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, leaving an indelible mark on the course of British history. At this time, George Booth's revolt was taking place, with Sir Thomas Middleton and Sir Echad Wynne rising in North Wales, while George Booth was rising in Cheshire. However, these were the only two areas that rose, and, as a result, the full weight of the new model army under General Lambert was waiting for them, rendering their efforts futile. Sir Echad Wynne was caught in the fallout and taken to Conwy Castle, where he was imprisoned. In the dungeon, a conversation unfolds. "I would have had you in the dungeon, mother. I did not think to see you. My keeper permits me no leave." A reply comes, "I met the colonel. He's a villain, is he not?" The response is, "I found him amenable, he's Parliament's creature. Courtesy will loosen a door rather than spite, Echad, and a ready purse is more persuasive still. I think he will see you released." At 12:45, anticipation was to be counted. "I am in no mood for wooing. Perhaps you were enjoying your little game too much. There was a time to end this tyranny under which we live, mother. If General Monk had joined me, but he did not. He waited to see how the die would fall, and the army are in dispute. Our king may return, and our pays rest upon that hope, but some new Lord Protector may rise in Cromwell's place. We have weathered this long darkness, estate and family intact, but you do not throw away your winter garb at the first bud of spring snows, may return as quickly as they are banished. You were of no use to me." He recalls the habits of a courting youth and practices them upon the colonel. "My pulse will do the rest." The failure of the Booth Rebellion, a terrible blow to Sir George Windibank and all royalists across the county. Even in its weakened state, Cromwell's Commonwealth has somehow hung on, but their disappointment wouldn't last for long. Across the English Channel, King Charles, the first son and heir to the throne, the fate of the Stuart dynasty rests on his shoulders amidst the complexities of state, church, and society. At 600 hours, he was patiently waiting in exile, and within a year he would be summoned back to London, and the new Stuart king would be back on the throne. The Booth Rebellion of 1659 had failed to bring down the Commonwealth, but it had not been totally in vain. The actions of Sir George Booth, Sir Thomas Middleton, and Sir Richard Willies, the younger, had inspired another key figure of the era, General George Monk, Governor of Scotland. Monk was a man of floating allegiance. At one point, he considered defending Richard Cromwell. Later, he thought of joining Booth's rebellion. But now, in 1660, he was launching his own uprising. He led his army of loyal soldiers down from Scotland to London, and no one could stop him. He became the most powerful man in the country. However, Monk was not in the mould of Oliver Cromwell. There would be no new Lord Protector. He made overtures to the Stuart family in exile. They were the only ones who could offer the country the stability it so desperately needed. General Monk realized that the mood in the country was such that the Stuarts were the only viable option, and thus he paved the way for the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, with Charles II returning to the throne, marking the beginning of a new era in British history. At 1845, the situation was thus. Parliament was fed up with Cromwell, who was fed up with the rule of the major generals. The army had stopped being on the side of the revolution, and the army was evolving to the king. Once that happened, there was no hope of keeping Richard Cromwell. As he didn't have any of his father's bullying strength, he was a quiet man. Anyway, there's something absurd in having given up the concept of monarchy, thinking that there should be a hereditary protectorate, even though the Great Rising didn't happen and it was put down. Nevertheless, all eyes were on it, and at that moment, George Monk makes his move. He could have been king, of course, and in fact, the throne was offered to him, albeit tentatively, in the way of him becoming the inheritor of the protectorship. Wisely, he decided it's much better to be the kingmaker than the king, so he is the grand choreographer who brings Charles back, or enables Charles to come back, of course. Charles doesn't actually win back the throne, it's Parliament and the people who bring him back. At 1860, a Commonwealth that lost its leader, for they had not got somebody to succeed Oliver Cromwell, who possessed the substance of the respect of both Parliament and the army to take his place. It was truly because of Oliver Cromwell's death and the inability of anyone following him to grasp that power that eventually the English resorted to default and thought, well, they would have a king back. Then, Charles had spent most of his exile in the Dutch city of Breda. On the 4th of April, 1660, he issued the Declaration of Breda, promising a general pardon for crimes committed during the Civil War, recognition of property rights, religious toleration, and payment of army wage arrears. 4 days later, the Parliament in London proclaimed Charles king. At once, the young exile made preparations in Europe to return home. Charles II and his advisers were convinced that if there were conditions, they would be very onerous, and they would probably be close to what Charles I had turned down before his trial and execution. At 12 noon, the English Parliament had completely changed its stance in just 2 months by early 1660. Although he had promised that everything would be settled by Parliament, he was returned unconditionally, meaning Parliament passed the declaration that he had been king since the moment of the death of his father of royal memory. So, they said, come back unconditionally. But thank you for your promise that you will accept any settlement we make on the most neutral terms. At 9:30, Charles landed at Dover on the 25th of May. He made his way to London, which he reached 4 days later. He had deliberately timed it so he would enter the city on his birthday. He was exactly 30 years old. The people of London were lining the streets. The crowds were so thick that it took 7 hours to cross the still familiar city. Perhaps some of them had been there that cold January morning more than a decade earlier, when the king's father had been beheaded in Whitehall. Now they were cheering the return of the Stuarts. Charles II had come home. At 12 o'clock, the multitude gathered to claim his crown. A great multitude, indeed, in such spirit, too, holding the king's picture aloft, which was near a hanging matter but weeks ago. It must be all of London. We shall know if he is coming from the cold. They lined the streets like this from Dover to Whitehall in all the years of Cromwell. Did you ever see such a thing? No, no. Can I remember when last week you had an afternoon of leisure such as this? He will be a fine king. I am sure of it. Despite the general pardon offered by Charles and his declaration at Breda, Not every crime was forgotten. 50 people were deliberately excluded from Charles' acts of forgiveness. 9 men who had signed his father's death warrant were executed. The identity of the executioner who actually carried out the beheading of King Charles I is still a mystery to this day. As for Oliver Cromwell, the man who usurped Charles' father, even after death, he will be held accountable, as with the judge who oversaw Charles' trial, John Bradshaw. At 1845, Henry Eighton, who had signed the king's death warrant, was amongst those removed from their graves and hanged for the crowds to witness before they were all decapitated and their heads placed on spikes. There was one part of him that was unforgiving, and that was his attitude towards those who had been involved in the death of his father. This included the 59 men who signed the death warrant, and another 20 or so who held legal offices in the court case or were on the scaffold at the execution. Charles' hatred for them never ended. The people he most blamed for his father's death had their heads cut off, and their bodies were turned into a lime pit, with the heads stuck on spikes on the Palace of Westminster. At 9:20, it is thought he just adored his father and couldn't believe that these people could expect any sort of sympathy at all. There was also an underlying point that if he had been soft with them, what would it have said about him as a monarch? At 1845, Charles II's return marked a significant shift, as his focus was on those responsible for his father's death. Life drastically changed with the king's return, as Puritan oppression was lifted almost immediately. A new era of liberty and debauchery emerged, with a cultural explosion, poetry thriving in the arts, and theatres reopening with women appearing on stage for the first time. The sciences also flourished, with luminaries such as Sir Isaac Newton expanding human knowledge. When Charles II returned, there was an enormous mood of optimism, partly due to his clever approach, as he was prepared to tolerate many who had supported the Civil War. Being a genial person on some levels, and certainly politically intelligent, he created an atmosphere in which political reconciliation could occur. Charles II was keen to work with as many people who had worked with Cromwell as possible, seeking healing and settlement. At this time, Charles II himself would be the founder of the Royal Observatory, as seen in this painting from its earliest days. He had an interest in the burgeoning field of natural sciences and would grant a charter to the Royal Society. Sir Owen Wynne would not get to see much of the establishment, as he died in the same year King Charles II was crowned. The period that Sir Owen Wynne had lived under so cautiously in the last years of his life was now called the Interregnum. So, Owen's sons, Sir Richard Wynne, the young freshly released from Caernarfon Castle, inherited the Wynne estate. Sir Richard Wynne's uncle had been such a key figure in the court of Charles I. There was no reason to believe that the Wynne family would not prosper once again now that the Stuarts were back. King Charles II was finally in a position to restore the family's fortunes. At 1862, King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, and the nation of tea drinkers was born. Catherine brought over the custom of tea drinking from Portugal, and it quickly became popular amongst the aristocracy. At that time, Richard Wynne the Younger would be a key part of this restored royal court, taking up the position of Chamberlain to Charles' new queen. A delighted nation dubbed the new king the Merry Monarch. But just like his father, Charles had married a Catholic, and the religious difficulties that had so blighted the past did not simply disappear. However, there were far more pressing problems just around the corner. The worst outbreak of plague since the Black Death occurred, and by 1866, the Great Fire of London had left the city in ruins. At 9 o'clock, the fire was dying. Lady Grace said, "Let me summon the maid. I have brought it back to life. It is quite all right. I can manage a fire. Sit. I thought I heard the footpost not long ago. Yet I know that cannot be. I forbade the London post from approaching our gates, and none would be so disrespectful as to disobey my wishes. Do not blame the poor man. No, I do not. You commanded him, and he obeyed, as he should. I had not heard from Richard in so very long. He lives. Then the existence of the letter was all you needed to know that I fear it is very bad this time. I remember the plague in 1625. I was younger than you, not long married. Ulter John kept cats outside for days at a time, happy as he was to see his finest purchases ruined, than risk plague within our walls. He must be destroyed. It is one letter that has passed through what hands and what parts of the county we know not. Every moment it is in this house. The danger deepens. I will have it removed. At 1765, the Great Plague of London hit the city. There had been large outbreaks throughout the 17th century, particularly in 1625 and 1636, but nothing as severe as this. It would be the last major outbreak of the disease to occur in England. A quarter of the population of the capital died in little over a year. Plague had been something they had all lived with forever. It's something that they were fairly wise to. There are accounts of bolts of cloth, for example, being sent up from London, which would be kept outside the gates of a town for up to 2 weeks, so the goods would not be allowed into the main area. They would be kept outside by the gate, and they would observe for 2 weeks. They knew that one thing was certain. If you have an infected cargo that came into somewhere like a town, the house would get it. King Charles II and the family escaped to Salisbury, and England's Parliament relocated to Oxford. By the spring of 1666, the outbreak had died down. At 1200 hours, the Great Fire of London broke out on the 2nd of September, 1666. The fire, which began in a Pudding Lane bakery, spread out of control and burned for 3 days straight, gutting the medieval heart of the city and utterly destroying the ancient St. Paul's Cathedral. Fears abounded that the fire was a foreign plot, and King Charles II worried that the entire city might fall into anarchy. At the time, England was at war with the Netherlands, and the Dutch saw the fire as a divine retribution for the actions of the English Navy and Rear Admiral Robert Holmes, who had set the town of West Terschelling ablaze in what became known as Holmes Bonfire. The disasters that befell Charles, including the hammer blow of the plague, the fire, and the wars with the Dutch, meant that he was out of kilter with the political feeling of the people. Meanwhile, the people of England were predominantly in favour of the Dutch state. At 1800 hours, Charles II was facing battles on all fronts, just like the Stuart kings who had come before him. His capital burned to the ground, the economy in the doldrums. The only reason why he had gone to war in the first place was to try to help the economy. At 1900 hours, the Dutch Republic was in the midst of its golden age, lucrative trade routes across the globe. Charles' longer brother, James, had suggested they seize lucrative colonial possessions from the Dutch, disrupt their trading dominance. Charles agreed. He was keen for a popular war to boost his standing. At 2000 hours, the war was not a success. The Netherlands may have been a small nation, but had a far superior navy and much more money. Disasters such as the Great Fire of London further sapped England's ability to prosecute the war. By 1667, the Dutch controlled much of the waters around the islands of Britain. At 6:30, south of England, they had secured pivotal European alliances, and that June they staged a devastatingly bold naval assault, dubbed the Raid on the Medway. At 9, they attacked the English fleet at anchor in the mouth of the Thames, where many ships were destroyed, and it remains one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Royal Navy. Charles rushed to sue for peace. The Royal Oak burned, the Loyal London, and the Royal James too. The flagship sailed off without a single shot fired in its defence. By 12, I thought the Dutch are much less powerful than England. We are the more numerous, but they are rich, and they have directed their wealth with far greater wisdom. Since the last war, they have rebuilt their navy and made expert study of live navigation and warfare. And what have we done? Begged our garrisons with masks and courtly manners. I have no place there, then be done with London. Go not there again, the pride and pomp and luxury. All the jails of England hold no more cunning, a collection of thieves. At 1667, the treaty ending the war was signed in the town of Breda, where Charles had made his famous declaration that allowed him to return to the English throne several years earlier. Charles was humiliated, but it did at least bring the war to an end and allow London to be rebuilt. At that time, Charles encouraged the greatest architects to come forward with radical plans for the city. Had these been realized, London today would be a completely different place. However, in the end, practicalities and money meant most of the city was rebuilt on the same plan as before, but the buildings themselves were much changed. Here, the genius of Sir Christopher Wren did have the opportunity to shine, and his designs remain some of the most famous in the London skyline, because there was a sense of a new beginning. At 1830, the dawn of a new era emerged, not from complete novelty, but from a revival of the past, as numerous exciting events occurred during the Restoration. As it unfolded, the full reign of Charles II witnessed the birth of the Royal Society, with figures such as Boyle and Christopher Wren, who were scientists, architects, and literally rebuilding England. Furthermore, the Great Fire, as fortune would have it, enabled London to be rebuilt, and gloriously so. It must have been exhilarating to look around and find oneself in this spanking new city, surrounded by numerous, mind-bogglingly beautiful buildings, all around on a thriving Thames, which was teeming with ships, commerce, entertainment, and theatres. It truly was a blessing to be alive during the reign of Charles II. As King Charles arranged for his city to be rebuilt, he was also building up forces for another battle with the Dutch Republic, which had so humiliated him. In secret, a new alliance was forged with Louis XIV. At 1670, King Charles II made a monumental decision. He signed a secret agreement with the French, known as the Treaty of Dover. Charles had been humiliated by a loss to the Dutch Republic 3 years earlier and was determined to gain revenge by joining forces with France to conquer the Dutch. However, one of the provisions of the pact was that Charles would convert to Catholicism. Charles was playing with fire, perhaps. The thing which historians are most divided about is what on earth he was doing in the Treaty of Dover when he told Louis XIV that he would become a Catholic if Louis would give him the money and the troops to make good his claim. There are plenty of people who think that he's being too clever by half, that he's simply using this as a device to get Louis to believe him and give him other things. I have always been inclined to think that Charles always meant to become a Catholic, that for most of his reign he could. Note: I have rewritten. At 1872, Charles made the first moves towards fulfilling part of the secret deal with King Louis XIV of France by making the Royal Declaration of Indulgence. It promised religious toleration for all, including Catholics. At that time, England was still fiercely divided by religion. A Catholic king would rip open old wounds. At 12 o'clock, a sense of reconciliation between England and Rome seemed to emerge following the great break of Henry VIII's reign. You seek stained glass for the new chapel. I shall not ask how you came by such intelligence, lest you implicate the walls and doors of my chamber. I had thought at last, in this county there are men in Paris who preserve the skill. Why not Rome? The king has declared indulgence on matters of religion and parliament. I care not if his declaration is even legal. I care not. I have an image in my mind. Mother, the chapel shall not be complete without it. It is a cross, a fine cross. I must have it. Working too long in the day, that took your father ill. It is not that you must, mother. It is not that we shall consult physicians. I have the outward applications having proved unsuccessful. They now prescribe inward medicines. And what course do they predict? I must have that glass, mother. After the declaration of indulgence, things became obviously much easier, At 2673, the youngest stood as the chamberlain of Queen Catherine of Braganza, endeavouring to acquire a stained glass cross for the new chapel he was constructing. Upon observation of the chapel, it would appear to be a Catholic chapel. In April 1672, merely a month subsequent to the Royal Declaration of Indulgence, England and France declared war on the Netherlands. However, it did not proceed according to plan. The financial backing promised by France to Charles was insufficient to cover the military expenses. Thus, the king was compelled to recall Parliament, which contained numerous members fiercely opposed to the royal declaration, deeming it far too generous to Catholics. They now had the king in a predicament, as Parliament refused to fund the war until the declaration was withdrawn. Charles was forced to comply, but worse was to come for the king, as the details of his secret pact with Louis XIV were leaked to the public. At 1874, Charles quickly realized that to defend his own position, he had to pull out of the alliance with France and end the war with the Netherlands. The Treaty of Westminster was signed, which brought peace between England and the Netherlands. The war had achieved precisely nothing. Fortunately, the full details of what he had agreed to never did come out, but it clearly helped to build the climate of anxiety in the 1670s about whether there was a drift back towards Catholic monarchy. There were still a lot of political tensions, and the constant question of if Charles couldn't produce a legitimate heir with Catherine of Braganza, who was going to succeed. Then, the realization that his brother, James, Duke of York, was a Roman Catholic led to a flaring up of intense anti-Catholic feeling, and part of that was driven by a wish to make sure that James could not become the future King of England. At the time, it was thought that Charles would have preferred a much quieter time than the one he was experiencing. At 20 past 1774, the death of Sir Richard Wynne occurred, a man who had been a member of Parliament for a total of 20 years, both before and after the interregnum. Without any male heirs, the Wynne estate passed to his daughter, Mary, whilst his title of baronet was bestowed upon his cousin, John Wynne. The strength of the Wynne family seemed to be dissipating. At 1774, Charles II returned to England, and numerous individuals across the county had held such high hopes, but his reign was turning out to be a disappointment, much like the Wynnes, as the Stuarts were losing power. Despite having many children with his numerous mistresses, King Charles had no legitimate heirs with his wife, Catherine of Braganza, and none would be born in the remaining 11 years of his life. The heir apparent throughout was his younger brother, James. Many suspected that James was a Catholic, and they were correct in fact. Charles II himself converted to the Catholic religion on his deathbed, having become incredibly ill in February 1685, very quickly and suddenly. At 12 o'clock, the king's condition took a turn for the worse, as he suffered a massive seizure, and subsequently he was handed over to the royal physicians, who, unfortunately, were ignorant of the proper course of action. 1970 years of medical knowledge had not equipped them to deal with such an illness, and thus they resorted to stimulating him in an attempt to get his energy pulsing through his body. To achieve this, they shaved off his hair and applied scorching hot glass to his scalp, put acid in his nostrils, and administered large doses of laxatives and enemas. Furthermore, they gave him tonics made from ground-up human skull and applied poultices of pigeon droppings to his feet. Although, on occasion, he seemed to be recovering, the general trend was towards death. Louise de Kerouaille, one of his mistresses, took James, Duke of York, the king's brother, aside and whispered, "Please, do not tell anyone I have said this, but his one desire has always been to die a Catholic." The evidence of Charles II's deathbed is, ultimately, the testimony of the small number of people who were witnesses to it, and it is widely accepted that, at 1851, the man who was supposed to have interceded into the church was someone who had helped him during his escape after Worcester, and had been, in that sense, someone he trusted for many years. For me, at any rate, it is the logical outcome. Out of the shadows, James brings a man called Father Huddleston, who had helped Charles survive during his 6 weeks on the run after the Battle of Worcester. James utters the immortal line, "I bring you now a man who once saved your life, and now hell save your soul." And Huddleston sits with the king and takes him through the various processes to bring him to Catholicism, including what I imagine was a long confession by Charles. He dies the following day, having just reconnected briefly with the 6 weeks in his life of which he was most proud, when he had shown himself to be brave and resilient. At this time, if anyone thought that the controversial issue of religious tolerance had gone away, they were mistaken. During the reign of Charles II, at 1830, James II would bring with it another crisis in England and another war. In the next episode of The Stewards of Bloody Reign, we see how the committed Catholic James II ascends to the throne of England, succeeding his brother. What had seemed an impossibility decades earlier was now a reality. The religious tensions across the British Isles reached fever pitch, and they would test the loyalties of the Wynne family at Gwydir Castle in their relationship with the House of Stuart. Across the county, plans were made to usurp the Catholic king, but the real danger lay very close to home. James' own daughter, Mary, and her husband, the Protestant William of Orange of the Dutch Republic, were the greatest threat of all. This would spell the end of the House of Stuart and the beginning of the Glorious Revolution. James II, the Catholic king of a Protestant country, was a disaster waiting to happen. The Stuarts' reign had begun with James I, then Charles I. Their belief in the divine right of king. At 1885, King Charles II died, having ruled over England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland for a quarter of a century, following the restoration of the monarchy after the Civil War. At the time, the kingdom remained simmering with Catholic and Protestant sentiment, and King James II was a last desperate attempt at a Stuart monarchy. 1785 marked the beginning of his reign, and he was a very brave, headstrong figure, a very good soldier, and a very good admiral, but being pig-headedly Roman Catholic was his undoing. He went on an all-out, very rapid process of Catholicization, which completely wrecked the popular base of his power that he had enjoyed in his first year. He was, in some ways, a very competent person, but he threw it away for no particular reason. It was absolutely extraordinary. James II just thought he was going to do his bit as a Catholic king, and it went spectacularly wrong. At 1850, the Commonwealth of Oliver Cromwell came to an end. Charles converted to the Catholic faith on his deathbed and would be succeeded by his younger brother, King James II, a man who had been Catholic for nearly 2 decades in a country that was now officially Protestant. This was a grave concern, as James II's reign would not last long. At this point, the series has examined the reign of the 4 Stuart monarchs through the lives of the Wynne family, who lived here at Gwydir Castle in North Wales. The Wynnes owned hundreds of acres of land surrounding the castle, and they prospered enormously during the Stuart era. It all began with John Wynne, who inherited the Wynne estate in 1580, during the reign of the earliest Stuart monarch, King James I. John Wynne would be knighted, and the family would be honoured with the title of baronet during King Charles I's reign. Guidance was overseen by John Wynne's son, Sir Owen, and Sir Richard. It was at this point that the connection between the Wynne family and the ruling Stuart dynasty became pronounced. At 1871, Lady Sarah dies, very young. In 1674, at the age of 39, Sir Ichad dies as well, too young. Previously, around the same period, the strongest of all was Sir Ichad Wynne, a close personal friend of King Charles I. But then the Civil War broke out, and the king was beheaded. Sir Ichad never recovered and died, just a few months after he witnessed his friend and king being publicly executed. At that time, Owen Nguyen had to care for the estate with his wife, Lady Grace, during the challenging period of Oliver Cromwell's rule. With the restoration of the monarchy and the return of King Charles II, the Wynnes would prosper once again, this time with Sir Owen's son, Sir Ichad Wynne the Younger, back in the restored royal court. However, Sir Ichad Wynne the Younger had no male heirs, meaning the estate passed to his daughter, Mary, known to everyone as Marley, along with her grandmother, Lady Grace. It was their job to maintain the Wynnes' state in the new era of the Restoration. At 17, Lady May, the sole child, finds herself in possession of a vast estate. Following this, Lady Grace Wynne, her grandmother, emerges as a pivotal figure, navigating the complexities of marriage arrangements until a suitable match is found. In 1678, a marriage is arranged with young Lord Willoughby de Eresby, also known as Robert Bertie, later to become the Duke of Ancast, a Member of Parliament. The wealth the Wynne family had accumulated during the reign of King James I, however, could not be transferred through the female line, resulting in it being passed to a junior branch of the Wynne family. Subsequently, the Willoughbys acquired the Gwydir estate, marking the point at which the direct connection between the Wynnes and the land, landscape, and people of North Wales ceases, as it becomes a secondary estate, an additional part of the Willoughby holdings. At 1633, King James II was born in James's Palace in London, the second son of King Charles I, and his wife, Henrietta Maria. 1649 marked the year his father was executed, and by this time, James had already managed to escape from his confinement at the age of 15, disguised as a woman, making his way to The Hague in the Netherlands, a place where he would spend much of his life. The Wynne family, once very powerful, was now losing influence and status, much like the Stuarts. Meanwhile, Paul Willoughby de Eresby, a Lincolnshire family based at Grimsthorpe Castle, went on to become the Earl and then the Duke of Ancaster and Kesteven, rendering him very important. At 16, his elder brother was proclaimed king by the Royalists and the parliaments of Scotland and Ireland. Charles was even crowned in Scotland in 1651, but the Stuart family was unable to reclaim England, and eventually Oliver Cromwell prevailed, becoming the undisputed ruler of a new Commonwealth. Charles and his brother James sought exile in France, their mother's homeland, and it was during this time abroad that James was exposed to the beliefs and ceremonies of the Catholic religion. As time went by, he was drawn to that faith with great conviction. James even served in the French army, but France chose to ally itself with Oliver Cromwell. The Stuart family made an alliance with Spain as a result, and James switched over to the Spanish forces and battled his previous French colleagues. James learned to be a soldier, and he had fought first for the French and then for the Spanish. He had fought for the French until he was driven out of the French army by the treaty by which Cromwell's power was recognized. At this time, allied with France against Spain, James initially fought for the Spanish side, and in fact, in one of the last of the great battles of the new model army, back of the dunes up in France and Belgium, the English armies of Cromwell were opposed by James, who was considered a brave fighter and was on the brink of accepting the rank of admiral in the Spanish Navy. When the collapse of Cromwell's protectorate in England rapidly changed those prospects, James declined the Spanish offer within months. Upon his brother's claim to the English throne, James returned to London and was soon appointed Lord High Admiral of the Navy, becoming one of his brother's closest advisers, and was widely praised for his tireless efforts to extinguish the Great Fire of London. However, in private, his religious allegiances were shifting, as his wife, Anne Hyde, had converted to the Catholic religion almost as soon as the couple had returned to London. By the late 1660s, James had converted, and it is now known that he was formally receiving the Catholic Church in 1668. At the time, he continued to attend Protestant services for a few years, but news about his private attendance at Catholic Mass as well as his receipt of Catholic confessions, began to leak out. By 1676, James publicly declared his conversion, sparking a crisis, as the heir to the throne was going to be a Catholic. Consequently, a huge political campaign emerged to prevent this from happening. At 1800 hours, it becomes clear that history is very tough on James II. He is often forgotten, except for the disaster of his 3 years as king. However, he was a very brave, headstrong figure, a very good soldier, and a very good admiral, who had fought bravely and possessed many admirable qualities. Unfortunately, his pig-headed devotion to the Catholic faith ultimately led to his downfall. In 1673, a critical year in the life of the future King James II, his first wife, Anne Hyde, who had converted to the Catholic faith long before him, had died in 1671. James was about to marry his second wife, and this event would significantly impact his future. At 1773, the year of the Test Act, was also the year of significant turmoil. This penal law, passed by Parliament, required all civil and military officials to take an oath declaring their allegiance to the Anglican Church. James was in an impossible position, as he could not betray his principles and make such an oath. He refused and resigned as Lord High Admiral. There had been murmurs abound that he converted to the Catholic faith, and he was now married to a Catholic bride from Italy. Those murmurs now seemed confirmed by James' refusal to make that oath required by the Test Act. At the time, the difficulty with James II was that everyone knew he was Catholic. It was not something he could hide, nor something he wanted to hide either. Obviously, when push came to shove at the Test Act, he had to simply resign his commission as admiral, and that meant he was okay because he did not have to do any signing, he did not have to do any oath. The fact that James' elder brother, King Charles II, had no legitimate heir changed the course of events. At this time, James became the focus of numerous conspiracy theories, as many suspected there were plots to assassinate Charles and replace him with James. Anti-Catholic sentiment rose again across the country following the Test Act. The sheer scale of the number of people who resigned took people by surprise, as they had no idea there would be so many secret Catholics. The great anxiety of what would happen if a Catholic did become king led people to claim that there was a conspiracy at the top of government to assassinate Charles and hasten James' accession to the throne, known as the Popish Plot. It was claimed that there were a large number of people conspiring to assassinate the king, and that if James did not know about it, he was turning a blind eye to it, and in any case, he was the beneficiary of what they were doing. At 1245, the assassination of the king and the succession of the Catholic rule led to the introduction of an act that would prevent Catholics from benefiting from the assassination, as there would be no point in killing the existing king, particularly one who had been fairly lenient towards the Catholic population. To soothe the world public, King Charles II arranged for James' daughter Mary to marry the Protestant William of Orange. James reluctantly consented to the match. The marriage of William of Orange, who was of royal British blood and therefore had a potential claim to James' elder daughter, gave him a potential focus for those who were not prepared to tolerate a Catholic king. However, this was not enough to relieve the growing hysteria in the country and in Parliament. In 1679, the Exclusion Bill was introduced into the House of Commons, which, if passed, would have prevented James from inheriting the throne because he was a Catholic. At 1800 hours, the Exclusion Bill was having a profound impact on Gwydir Castle, where Marley Nguyen had married Lady Betty Lod Willoughby Daisby the previous year. He had attempted to gain election into Parliament, albeit unsuccessfully, and his grandmother, Lady Grace, eagerly awaited correspondence from him as unrest spread across the county. This was precipitated by the thought of King Charles II's brother, James, becoming the first Catholic monarch. My lady, thank you. postal service. There are no others that could deliver your letters. Grandmother, the years have not ended. He has not passed his use. I cannot conceive of Guarda without him, but surely there are others who can share his burden. Master Williams has a son, a boy. He is 19 years of age. How far is your husband's recovery from his disappointment? He resolves to stand again in the next election, but when that will be, the exclusion is so much in the ascendancy. Even if the bill passes through the Commons, it will fail in the Lords. I pray to see the Duke of York will be king. Child, fool. The notion persists. At 1881, the bill was finally defeated when it was rejected by the House of Lords. Clearly, the failure of the exclusion and the revenge which was taken by the regime in dismissing so many prominent supporters of exclusion from their positions will produce, as always, historic consequences. In my time, I pay, but does the Duke not abide by his conscience, his principles? Principles are an over-admired thing. I wonder, though, that the exclusionist mind, can the law alter what God has settled? If Parliament can choose itself a king, why not attend to his Lord? It pulls a society's very fabric, I fear. I suppose Master Williams can learn the duties of a gatekeeper. They grow so fast, the young. Let us see if we can keep pace and tell him of his new apprentice. The bill bitterly divided the Commons. Indeed, parts of the modern British parliamentary system can be set a date from this dispute. Those who backed the exclusion bill became known as the Whigs. Those against became known as the Tories. At 7 o'clock, the only solution considered was to assassinate Charles and James. There was a lot of talk, but it was not at all clear how much action there was to plan to intercept him as he returns to London from the races in Newmarket. However, they return early, and so the plot hadn't matured. When you have plots, they are always people going to betray them, because you cannot make a plot work without a lot of people knowing, and if a lot of people know, it is increasingly likely somebody will know who will betray it. And that is what happens. At 1883, the botched assassination attempt on the Stuart brothers provoked a wave of sympathy for James. Several Whig opponents were implicated, and James's position was strengthened further. As a result of their fall, the Catholic Duke of York would indeed be king. King James II was crowned on 23 April 1685. However, almost immediately, he faced a rebellion from his own nephew, the Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth was the eldest illegitimate son of King Charles II. He proclaimed himself king, sparking a rebellion that would ultimately lead to his downfall. At 9 o'clock, the true king, James II, was facing a significant threat from his nephew, the Duke of Monmouth, who had declared himself the true king. In Dorset, the Monmouth rebellion attempted to overthrow King James II. At Gwydir, the situation was followed closely, particularly because Malice's husband, Robert Betty, was a captain now fighting on behalf of King James in the attempt to swiftly crush the rebellion. At 7 o'clock, it was reported that there was great joy to hear of the efforts in London and the Commons on behalf of their new king. There was great rejoicing at Gimstop as well, where, on the previous Sunday, the parson had read from the pulpit His Majesty's words, which were thought to be very fine, and noted well. The king declared that he shall make it his endeavour to preserve this government, both in church and state, as it is by law established, and he shall never depart from the rights and prerogative of the crown, nor invade any man's property. The person gave it much importance, for the word of a king is more secure by far than any mutable law. Lord William Budesby was holding office under James II, and was also, interestingly, a captain. At 1885, under King James, fighting occurred at the Battle of Sedgemoor against the Duke of Monmouth and the Monmouth Rebellion. The Monmouth Rebellion was quickly dealt with, as was another rebellion in Scotland that occurred at the same time, known as Argyll's Rising, led by the Earl of Argyll. These two rebellions had been coordinated together, but neither of them was able to drum up enough volunteers. In the end, both the leader, Monmouth, and the Earl of Argyll were captured and executed. The rebellions were put down with ease, but they deepened James' insecurities. He strengthened his army and put loyal men in charge of the regiments. This might have eased his worries, but the actions caused alarm in Parliament. A standing army of such size was not a tradition, and many of the chosen commanders were Catholics. This placed Lady Willoughby's husband, Lord Willoughby's, position as captain under threat. At 1805, Obet led a troop of horse against Monmouth. 1705 had seen the Gunpowder Plot, a last desperate attempt to return the Catholic monarch to the throne, but now, with King James II, the seemingly impossible had happened. My lady, perhaps you will not sit a moment. Well, I know you did so with my grandmother from time to time, perhaps in her memory. The king is displeased with the militia. He desires a standing army with officers he can trust. Though my husband has been turned out of his employment as captain, no, his brothers. The king has cleared the army of our whole family. I am sorry, my lady. We were only ever loyal, but our hope for advance now seems quite remote. At 1886, the new king's royal court was soon dominated by Catholics. A representative from Rome was welcomed for the first time since the days of Mary I, over a century before. By May, James sought a ruling from the courts to show he had the power to dispense with acts of Parliament. He fired judges who disagreed with him. The following year, he made a new declaration of indulgence, announcing religious toleration, including for the English Catholic minority, and ordered it be read from every pulpit in the land. The man thought to be the instigator of the Declaration of Indulgence was William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania, and member of a new religious movement that had arisen during Stuart rule, Quakerism. Penn went on a tour of the country to promote James' Declaration of Indulgence, but it was fiercely resisted by the Anglican clergy. James overplayed his hand. He wanted to give Catholics a lot of power, so they could demonstrate they could use it responsibly, so they could show they can be Catholics who can govern. At 1800, James II will live in peace with his Protestant neighbors, so he embarks on an extremely rapid process of Catholicization of the local government and the civil service. He is determined to reverse the penal laws, and to achieve this he must find individuals who will carry out his instructions, including Protestants. Consequently, the Anglican establishment is pushed aside, and numerous Quakers and Presbyterians, amongst others, are pressed into service to be nominated for Parliament. He alters the conditions of elections in towns so that town councils will elect MPs rather than the general electorate. And he narrows the franchise, subsequently nominating the individuals who will serve as town councillors. This is an extraordinary occurrence, and he summons every single existing MP, one by one, to inquire if they will support the repeal of the penal laws and the Test Acts. They all decline, so he must resort to even more desperate measures, which completely undermines the popular base of his power, a foundation he had previously enjoyed in his first year. At 1787, the Archbishop of Canterbury, along with 6 other bishops, defied the king's orders. The 7 bishops, as they were known, were soon arrested, taken to the Tower of London. However, their acts of resistance galvanized the public in an unexpected manner. The bishops were eventually acquitted at their trial, and this meant jubilant scenes up and down the nation, embarrassing the king. With each passing month of his reign, James seemed to mimic and exceed the example of his executed father, more and more. His attempts to rule as an absolute monarch were fiercely resisted. His reign, which had started with enthusiasm and general goodwill, was coming to a crashing end. It is believed he thought it was his duty as a Catholic prince to push forward the Catholic agenda in this country. He strayed into parts of life that were very threatening to the establishment. He got involved in the election of fellows at Magdalen College, Oxford, and it became a cause célèbre, with very important, influential people involved. At the end of the day, James II's absolute power led to his downfall, as he was put into prison for disagreeing with the establishment, having failed to learn from the lessons of the Civil War. On the 10th of June, 1688, King James and his wife, Mary of Modena, had a son who, according to the rules of primogeniture, was due to inherit the throne. However, James already had two daughters, Mary and Anne, from his first marriage, who had been raised Protestant in accordance with the wishes of King Charles II. The people had tolerated James' pro-Catholic rule, knowing his only possible successors were his Protestant daughters, but with the birth of the baby, there was a real threat of a permanent Catholic dynasty, which was unacceptable to many in the church and across the country. Furthermore, the child born to King James II and Mary of Modena was rumored to be a potential heir to the throne. At 1800 hours, the story went that the royal baby was stillborn, and another child was smuggled in to replace him, thereby ensuring a Catholic succession. When James II's second wife, Mary of Modena, had a son, even that was not enough, as clearly that boy should have been king in accordance with the law of succession. However, the Protestant establishment managed to claim that the baby had been smuggled in a bedpan, and thus was not the rightful heir to the throne. There was a ready-made heir in William and Mary, and their line. King James II knew he had a problem on his hands. He published testimonies of numerous witnesses who had been present at the birth of his son. He also made plans to pack the next parliament with his supporters and cement his grip on power. But then he received news of a fresh challenge to his authority. William of Orange, the husband of James' Protestant daughter Mary, was coming to England with an invasionary force. What became known as the Glorious Revolution had begun. They persuaded William, the Prince of Orange, to take the throne, marking a significant turning point in British history. At this time, William, who saw England as a very useful ally, particularly its wealth and navy, was willing to support the claim to a full public inquiry into the legitimacy of the new Prince of Wales, as he desperately wanted English resources, English troops, and, above all, English money to fight an all-out war against Louis XIV of France. By 1900 hours, the contender was William, who had pedigree, having been involved in several battles with the Catholic King of France, and was seen across Europe as a strong defender of the Protestant faith. His armada of 463 ships carried 15,000 fighting men. At 83 years after Guy Fawkes' attempt to end the rule of Stuart kings had failed, another attempt on another king, James, was about to begin, and this time it wasn't going to fail. At the 5th of November, 1688, fighting men across the Channel, William landed his forces at Torbay. The Glorious Revolution is sometimes known as the Bloodless Revolution. While that's not literally the case, it certainly was very low on casualties. When William of Orange's forces arrived on the English coast, the army of King James II that they were up against was twice the size. However, William knew he had support among the English, and his strategy was perfect. He gathered in the finances during his preparations for the war to pay his soldiers for 3 months in advance, meaning they were happy to delay any battle. William's patience paid off, as James' troops soon started to defect. An anti-Catholic riot spread across the land. The brief reign of James II was collapsing, and he knew it. Lord William Bedford advised his wife. At this time, Lady Margaret sought refuge in the relative safety of Gwydir Castle, as support for William of Orange was spreading, and she inquired, "How long will my lady and the children be in residence?" The response was, "As long as my husband deems it necessary for our safety." The general insurrection was ongoing, and Lady Margaret asked, "How do you perceive the local sentiment? The king jailed our Lord Bishop. Some might make that in his favour, others less. But do you detect any general inclination for or against him?" My lady replied, "My husband is for the Duke of Orange. He marches on York with his brothers, and his uncle stays at court, so the family can claim loyalty should the enterprise go awry." Lady Margaret then inquired. "But what then? Have you obtained any letters?" And was told, "I shall have them bought at once, day or night." James' real problem lay in the fact that he was relying on certain loyalties that were no longer intact, particularly those of his own children, the two daughters, Mary and Anne, who had been persuaded to put their Protestantism above their duties as daughters, a situation that was, of course, devastating. At 1800 hours, a significant blow was dealt to James when he discovered that some of his finest generals had made it clear they would fight against the king rather than for him, including John Churchill, who became the first Duke of Marlborough. Marlborough had been the instrument who had defeated Monmouth at the Battle of Sedgemoor 3 years earlier. Perhaps it was due to his Protestantism that he could not bear to help a Catholic, but James was correct to say that he had taken him from an obscure page boy, given him a commission, and helped him on his way, and now this young, brilliant commander was fighting against him. When William's commanders arrived, James' troops were largely mercenaries. They were not Catholics, and, as mercenaries always do, they made a calculation on whether they thought they would win. James was having some sort of nervous breakdown, experiencing incessant nosebleeds, which were clearly hypertension, and he was clearly behaving irrationally. The professional soldiers, such as John Churchill, were not foolish, and James' fate was becoming increasingly tied to the whims of his generals. At this time, at 1800 hours, the Duke of Marlborough would gaze upon his commander-in-chief and ponder the notion that this was not a gentleman with whom one would desire to serve. To have one's daughter aligned against oneself in a matter of utmost gravity, a question of life and death, and the future of one's dynasty, must have been thoroughly devastating on a personal level. However, the thought persisted throughout his remaining years that, after all, Charles II had staged a comeback against all odds. Although it never transpired, there were a considerable number of individuals in England who were playing a double game, discreetly communicating with James in the event that he should return, as they were apprehensive about suffering beheading. 60,000 men, although Robert maintains that this number is continually dwindling, have taken York as the northern nobles declare their allegiance to King William, who marches west to engage the prince. With 40,000 men, Prince William's army grows, whilst entire armies abandon the king's cause day by day. 1875 is often cited as a pivotal year, my lady. Well, Obet is very hopeful. Unwilling to make the compromises that might have saved his reign, James headed himself to flee the country. He ordered his unreliable army to disband. His wife and baby son left for France in early December. And when it came his turn to follow, James, fortunately, dumped the Great Seal in the Thames. Without it, no lawful parliament could be called. James fled to France to join his family, and William let him go. It is done. The king has fled to France, the Queen and the Prince of Wales too, with scarce a battle or bloodshed. We shall be making arrangements for you to return to Gimstop. We shall also sell these knees, aren't much up to chasing the young ones. They have been most contented here, as have I. 1789 was a year of great change. King James' escape to France was actually a total farce. The yacht that was meant to take him across the Channel was boarded by English fishermen. They had no idea who he was. They thought he was a Jesuit spy. He was kept prisoner for a week. At 5 o'clock, the news of James' flight spread like wildfire. By 8 o'clock, the council had assembled, and by 9 o'clock, the decision was made to invite William to take the throne. 1 month later, James was forced to leave, and William was proclaimed king. The year that followed was one of great upheaval, as the country struggled to come to terms with the new monarch. 2 years after James' flight, the Battle of the Boyne took place, marking a decisive victory for William. 3 years later, the Treaty of Limerick was signed, bringing an end to the war in Ireland. 4 years after James' flight, the country was still reeling from the consequences of his departure. In the aftermath of Yarmouth's departure, the country was left to pick up the pieces, and William was faced with the daunting task of restoring order. One of his first acts was to call a new parliament, which convened in early January. The parliament was made up of 160 members, all sworn to loyalty to William. Two of the most prominent members were John Somers and Thomas Wharton, who would play a crucial role in shaping the country's future. 3 months later, the Parliament passed the Bill of Rights, which established certain fundamental rights and freedoms. 4 months after that, the country was still grappling with the implications of James's departure. At 1888, the exile of James II marked a pivotal moment in British history, as the Stuarts of England, Scotland, and Ireland navigated the complexities of state, church, and society. At this time, the fate of the Wynne family of Gwent Castle in North Wales was intricately tied to the Stuarts, with their tumultuous reigns of James I, Charles I, Charles II, and James II, characterized by struggles with Parliament, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. Prior to this, around 1700, James II was forced to flee London, and by 1788 he had been escorted back to the coast, where he was placed on a boat to France, with instructions that on no circumstances was he to be allowed to escape. However, he was rescued by fishermen in Faversham and subsequently allowed to escape to France, where he was taken in by Louis XIV, who provided him with his own court at Saint-Germain near Paris. Within a matter of weeks, Parliament declared that James had abdicated the throne and that it was vacant, and William and Mary were declared joint monarchs, as the promise of a stable succession had been so important to the elevation of James VI to the throne in 1603. So it was the peace and security embodied by William and Mary that ultimately secured the crown for them. At 42, the status of the crown is subjugated to that of Parliament, and it is James, due to his 3 years of intensely unintelligent prejudice, who brings it to a head, finally, so that the British Parliament gets the upper hand from then on. 1790 marks the year James did not give up, as he was planning an attempt to reclaim the throne, just as his elder brother Charles had done. With the help of the French, he landed in Ireland and raised an army to seize back the throne, but was defeated by William at the Battle of the Boyne. James fled, never to return to England. It is unlikely James II was a natural quitter. It was because of the overwhelming evidence that it was over. He simply misjudged the central tenet of the Protestant establishment in England, particularly when they looked overseas to France and saw what Louis XIV was doing to Protestants, treating them with savagery, people being broken on the wheel, literally broken on a wagon wheel, or being executed in other ways. At 1701, James died in exile, convinced that he had lost his throne because God had punished him for his adultery. His remains were destroyed during the French Revolution, and so too were his memoirs, meaning that we do not have an awful lot of his perspective. By 1715, his son, the reported impostor James Francis Edward, became known as the Old Pretender, and he stated a rebellion, the Jacobite Rising, and tried to restore the exiled Stuart dynasty. He failed. At 1719, there was another attempt, with Spanish support, but it was just as ineffective. Then, at 1745, King James II's grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, made one final shot at the crown. At 1689, Lady Mary Wynne, the last of the Wynne family, dies, marking the end of Gwydir Castle's glory. By this time, the county had moved on, and King James II was the last Stuart king. The Wynne family spanned the entire rise and fall of the Stuarts, with Sir John Wynne being knighted in 1606, 3 years after James I came to the throne as one of the very first baronets. Charles I was served loyally by Sir Richard Wynne, the second baronet, whilst the fourth Baronet, Richard Wynne the Younger, was Chamberlain to the Queen of Charles II. The brief reign of James II was followed by the Glorious Revolution in 1688. The four Stuart men who ruled England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland each wrestled with similar problems. The scope and nature of government were contested at this time as never before, making their era divisive and often bloody. However, the reigns of the Stuart kings saw the beginnings of the modern British state, the unification of England and Scotland, the last death throes of absolute monarchy, and the rise of Parliament as the dominant power in the land. At the beginning of this period, in 1606, the Stuarts' complexities of state, church, and society were navigated, shaping the course of British history and the evolution of the modern state, as seen through the lens of the Wynne family of Gwydir Castle in North Wales.